Father, Son, and Violin. A personal life story tells the vivid of Mao's China. Daniel Olson Chen. Dedicated to my parents and all of their generation.
Special acknowledgements.
My special thanks to Ms. Mercedes Larbenz. Without her encouragement and inspiration, hard work in editing, artwork and her publishing assistance, this book would never have been made public. Chapter 17, The Fifth Stage of My Violin Life. 1. How Australians Value My Violin Playing. On the aircraft headed for Melbourne, I recalled the last 20 years of my personal history. A history of struggle, from falling in love with the violin at first sight during primary school, so much so that often after school I walked a few kilometers to the music store just to stare at it, my nose flattened against the glass cabinet, with help from Master Zhou, making my first white violin at age 13, during my middle school time competing with my big rival Ma Xiaomao in the Mao propaganda team. Overhearing Western violin pieces played by my first violin teacher Li from a church window. Then becoming the concertmaster of the Changsha Amateur Orchestra, a conflict with conductor Xiao at the Changsha Opera, fighting with foreman Peng at the construction company for the right to play violin, an ignorant and shameless struggle for the position as concertmaster at the Hunan Beijing Opera, the hardship and bitterness of education at the Shanghai Conservatory of Music, followed by money-making, the TOEFL test, a passport application, visa etc., walking such a long way until the day I was finally flying on a plane. If all of these facts couldn't prove that a man fighting for a better life is the correct way to prove that I won, I'm a violinist and I had been doing the right thing, what else can? In front of this hard fact, I think anyone would agree. So why am I not satisfied with myself? After much thought, I realized that for me to feel my success, even if I were recognized by the whole world, it still wouldn't be enough because there was one man who didn't recognize me, and for me, that one man was more important than all the people in the whole world put together. That man was my father. Yes, my father, and his attitude towards me, dismissive towards my success, was the wall standing between me and feeling satisfied, proud and fulfilled. Therefore, I must go on working harder to beat him, in any and all aspects. I must become a more respectable and richer person. I must speak better English than him, and my girlfriends, they must all be prettier than his wife. In short, emotionally speaking, as long as I could convince him and somehow make him appreciate and admire me, I would do anything. On the plane, excitement with anxiety, satisfaction with disappointment, hope with frustration, was a true reflection of my frame of mind at the time. I believe the majority of overseas students like me, who knew no one, had no family, no friends, no background, would have to go through a long and bitter process before they could gain legal immigration status and economic success. I must be luckier, or there must be a God who specially looks after me. I was totally financially safe after only 3 months in Australia, and 6 months later I started to feel rich, of course not that rich only to compare with my life in China. In less than 1 year I bought my own car, a house, and there was an Australian citizen waiting to change my identity from an overseas student to an Australian citizen. I have written another book that tells all the stories that happened to me in Australia and later in Norway. As this book, I want to concentrate on my violin life, so omit this personal life part. Indeed, I loved Australia, and still love it now. But there was one thing that made me very sad. That was how Australians valued my violin playing. I mean, my violin playing wasn't recognized nor appreciated by Australians. I had a considerably good income as a manager at a private institution, but could not give up my identity or value as a violinist. Though I took part in some rehearsals and concerts with several orchestras in Melbourne, none invited me or accepted me to be their full-time, regular member. This made me truly melancholy until one day when someone told me the reason. The reason was, though my violin playing techniques were okay, the style was quite different from the Westerners. To put it concretely, my violin sounded too harsh, too noisy. Apart from the factory-made violin and extremely cheap steel strings I used, the way of playing I had learned from the Shanghai Conservatory of Music was too energetic, in addition to some rebel from the Cultural Revolution left in my blood. Nevertheless, I, the little 9 brother, at that time, of course, was not able to realize my own problems, instead accusing the Australians of having rather low taste. Two, how Norwegians valued my violin playing. Except violin, life was wonderful in Australia. Work, friends, barbecue parties, or beach walking on weekends. When everything went well, I started to doubt if I really needed to make an effort to study in the USA. Or, why not get married with the Australian woman named Eileen Wong who was truly in love with me and settle myself down there? At exactly this time, I met Marianne, a Norwegian scholar who happened to be in Melbourne doing her research. We were pure friends, only meeting a couple of times and going to a movie together once. One night I woke up in a nightmare, and in the nightmare something about my father and my violin and Marianne. I made a midnight call to my new friend Marianne. On the phone I said, "Somehow I feel uneasy here in Australia." Marianne replied, "Come to Norway." That became the reason for a ticket to Norway. Norway should be a high-class Westerner's world, yet unfortunately, my violin playing was received the same as in Australia. First, I was rejected by 2 professional orchestras in Oslo. I only had a small position at a semi-professional orchestra far away from Oslo.
If you don't have anything else to do, why don't you get some education at the Norwegian State Academy of Music?
Marianne suggested. Being married to Marianne, a Norwegian citizen, everyday life and expenses were covered. I couldn't accept more, so I said,
"Of course, I would love to. And this is part of what I'm here for. But
I was thinking of finance, as I had no income here like I did in Australia, as I was jobless.
Education is free in Norway.
Marianne figured out what was on my mind.
free? You mean free?
I followed her advice and went to the Norwegian State Academy of Music for violin lessons. My teacher was Professor Ornulf Boy Hansen. I remember in the first lesson, he turned on a tape recorder and said,
"Play something for me, whatever you'd like to play is fine."
In order to show off my technique, I played Wieniawski's Tarantella, an extremely fast, difficult piece of music that I had spent more than 10 years practicing. After playing, I was quite proud of myself for not stopping in the middle and making no mistakes. But Professor Ornulf Boy Hansen looked somewhat amused. What hurt my feelings most was his comment.
"Music is not sports, it's not to see how fast your fingers can run."
Professor Ornulf Boy Hansen's teaching method was totally different from any of my former Chinese teachers. Unlike all other teachers who during the first lesson always asked me to change my way of holding the violin or the bow, Professor Boy Hansen gave me some very simple, easy melodies. Besides that, he asked me to listen to him giving lessons to others, Norwegian students, as if my profession was listening. In addition, he lent me some tapes and CDs, advising me to listen to more tapes and CDs at the Academy library. After a period of time, Professor Ornulf Boy Hansen handed me a tape, saying to me, "This is what I recorded at your first class." Take it home and listen to it carefully to see if there are some differences between the other tapes and CDs you have been listening to. After listening to my tape at home, I felt nothing was more convincing. I found that my recording was indeed very different from all of the other tapes and CDs. To put it concretely, my recording sounded more like the Chinese ballet, the Red Women Army, full of gunpowder, just like the great leader Chairman Mao's teaching. It was like a weapon that unites and educates the people against the enemy. While those Western recordings, such as the ballet Swan Lake, sounded soft and sweet, like someone once said, the art that has influence on and is appreciated by the human soul. Apart from my way of playing, the instrument, violin, itself that I played was very different from the violins Europeans were playing. They all used very fine, old Italian masters violins and fine expensive gut strings on them, while I, although updated to a handmade violin by a young master from Guangzhou instead of the factory-made violin I played in Australia, I was still playing on some very cheap China-made steel strings. Shang comes to Norway. No one knows the name Shang outside of China. But in China, many people still remember this name, even though she has disappeared from China for a few decades now. She is the second daughter of the most well-known violin family in China. Her elder brother, Shang is the symbol of a Chinese violinist. She was my teacher when I studied at the Shanghai Conservatory of Music, the absent-minded one. All of my violin experiences in the West made me very upset, so much so that I began to doubt that the Shanghai Conservatory of Music from which I graduated was really world-class. I decided to write a letter to my former teacher Shang. Shang wrote back to me immediately, with well-written handwriting and very nicely chosen words. She said,
"Couldn't be that bad, could it? Next time you take a lesson from Professor Boy Hansen, please also send my regards, and don't forget to tell him that if there is an opportunity, I would very much like to see how he teaches."
I honestly passed teacher Shang's message to Professor Ornulf Boy Hansen. Boy Hansen heard that and thought it would be a great idea. For if he not only teaches me, but also teaches my teacher Shang, afterwards teacher Shang could bring his method back to China and influence more Chinese people. In other words, Professor Boy Hansen would become the teacher of another nation. After some letters back and forth, I met my teacher Shang at Oslo airport. Just like the first time I went to Australia, she brought with her a violin, or should I say, a wooden box that looked like a violin, of mass production from a Chinese factory. The first time I took teacher Shang to meet my professor, she asked me to give Boy Hansen a tape of her solo performance. To my surprise, when I opened it there was no tape in the case. What confused my professor and I even more was that it was not a mistake. Teacher Shang took the tape out and gave him an empty case on purpose. I have no idea even to this day what purpose that could possibly have been. What made Professor Boy Hansen even more upset was upon their meeting for the first time, teacher Shang didn't mention exchange of teaching methods and ideas, or learning from him, but instead asked for the names and addresses of orchestras in Oslo, expressing her willingness to work for one of the professional orchestras there. The orchestra that teacher Shang applied for was the same one I had once applied for but only got to the second stage of auditions, not the final. As for teacher Shang, according to violin performing ability, being accepted as a member shouldn't be any problem, or so I thought. I was waiting for good news from my teacher, waiting for her to get into the orchestra. As a former student, I would be proud too, having more face, as the Chinese say, and also proof that the Shanghai Conservatory of Music was indeed world-class. It was only I who was not good enough. However, after a few days, an astonishing result came. Among the 7 applicants, only one couldn't get into the second stage, being eliminated in the first stage. That applicant was the greatest, most famous violinist in my motherland, a professor from the best music institution in China and the one I used to worship, my former teacher Shang. I had no idea what this strike meant to teacher Shang. To me, it was vital, critical even. To me, Norway, as a high-class Western country rejecting teacher Shang's way of violin playing was a negation of my 20 years' hard work and arduous struggle, a negation of my life. However, teacher Shang is a person not easily admitting defeat. At teacher Shang's strong request, Professor Boy Hansen helped arrange a violin recital for her. My heart was consumed entirely with good wishes, supporting her, hoping she could put all of her abilities to good use and obtain recognition from the Norwegians. I counted on her success to gain a little face back for my country, China, for the face of our education. To put all my hope into action, I gave, not lent, her as a present, my own violin, made by a Guangzhou master special for me. I prayed to God, to Buddha, to any gods existing in the universe, for my teacher Shang's successful recital. I expected the concert would be sensational, outstanding. I even imagined the newspapers, radio, and TV people interviewing Shang, and myself giving a cool translation. Teacher Shang's violin recital took place at the small hall of the Norwegian State Academy of Music. I went to the concert hall on the recital day very early. Waiting until the time was near, almost no one came into the hall, only the few who were already there. I felt rather abnormal and quickly ran to the door to tell the doorman to let people in. To my astonishment, there was no doorman, for there were no people to let in. I hurried back to the hall, carefully counting head by head, a total of less than 10 people if I remember correctly. All the people inside the hall were black-haired but for one blonde, the one playing piano accompanying teacher Shang. Nevertheless, I still hoped that among the 10, someone had come from the media, carrying a tape recorder or a video camera. If they put teacher Shang's recital in the papers, or on the radio or TV, it would also have some influence. However, sadly, teacher Shang's performance, how could I, a former student, put it into words? In a nutshell, when the show was over, I was glad that there were just a few people and felt lucky there were no media people there who might leave some recording as evidence. Teacher Shang did have many excuses for not having played as well as expected, just like in many of her previous performing experiences, such as one when she was young, she played an unsatisfactory solo because she took a medicine, which made her sleepy. Teacher Shang's 3-month visa as a visiting scholar passed quickly, like the blink of an eye, and I was busy thinking of something besides the violin that I could give her as a going back to the motherland gift. 3 months quiet and unknown in Norway, teacher Shang was suddenly in the newspapers, on TV and radio. The pity was, her face on the media wasn't because of her outstanding violin playing, but rather for a procedure of applying as a refugee. The justification for teacher Shang to be a refugee was outstanding, because if she goes back to China, her husband would beat her to death. The news of Shang Zhonghua's refugee application spread to the ears of Professor Ornulf Boy Hansen. He wasn't happy, not happy at all. He told me, "I invited your former teacher as a visiting scholar to Norway to learn my violin teaching technique and understand more about Western music, so that when she goes back she could benefit students in China. Since she intends to stay, it will be meaningless to go on with our project. This, Professor Boy Hansen found it a difficult to understand phenomenon, namely, Chinese intellectuals once out of the country don't want to go back. I dare say it's a perplexing phenomenon to most people in Western developed countries throughout the world. I will explain, for after the establishment of New China, Chinese intellectuals with the title of the stinking ninth category were among the lowest in social status. Throughout the countless political campaigns, the intellectuals were always among the targets of ridicule. As one slogan proclaimed, the more knowledge, the more reactionary, to the society. How could the Westerners possibly understand the inhuman suffering and ill-treatment Chinese intellectuals experienced? In addition, being extremely narrow-minded, selfish and short-sighted are general characteristics of the Chinese nation. Therefore, we, people from a mind one's own business and care for nobody nation, will rarely go back to the motherland once our feet are on other soil. This was the situation in the 80s. I am Chinese too, I possess all the Chinese characteristics, I am also a person who cares for nobody. However, I must care for teacher Shang, because after all, she was not only my former teacher, but also because I was the one who caused her to be in Norway in the first place. Hearing Shang had applied for refugee status, my first reaction was that she had cut off her back road, a road she can use to escape when she is cornered. The back road was her motherland. I immediately went to see Shang and blamed her for not discussing with me before she made such a big decision. I, although having been her violin student, did have more years in foreign countries, spoke more languages and knew a little more about local policies and legal systems. Shang smiled at me and silenced all of my complaints with one sentence.
I could do anything for love. For love, I would give up everything, such as fame, social status, face, everything.
Love. Love. No wonder she said if she goes back her husband would beat her to death. It reminded me of some rumor saying that after Shang gave birth to a child with her second husband, she started to see someone else, a tall young photographer. The young man somehow came to Norway first, and that became the true, secret reason Shang wrote to me so nicely about coming to study with my Professor Boy Hansen. Evidently, the rumor was true. Indeed, Shang was giving up her family, her career, her value as a violin professor, and even her future life in China. After hearing the word love, I really wondered if I should be happy for her or sorry for her, because I knew so clearly that although Norway, to the majority of people, may be the world's richest, safest, most free and leisurely paradise, it was definitely not the ideal place for teacher Shang to stay long-term, as Shang was a kind of person who constantly needs to be appreciated. To people like her, Norway would be the most monotonous, desolate, lonely, boring hell, because the value of teacher Shang, or her name, was limited to those only in the Chinese community. Therefore I thought, one day, someday, she would realize that and go back to where she belongs, the Chinese circle. Even if unable to return to the mainland, she would try to go to Hong Kong, Taiwan, or even Singapore or Malaysia. Thinking about all of this, I grew a kind of feeling that my helping Shang come to Norway was goodwill ending with a bad result. A sense of guilt came to my mind spontaneously. Meeting Shang Zhonghua. I think it was in the early 90s that I went back to China once and took that opportunity to visit teacher Shang's mother in Beijing. Shang's mother is a super mother who raised 11 musically talented children, among them the eldest son Shang Zhonghua is a great violinist, the idol and symbol of the new China violin soloist. The mother was staying with the eldest son, which gave me the chance to meet the greatest violinist, the one I couldn't possibly have dreamed to meet when I was a young boy. I went to see them with a heavy heart, as what I did for my teacher didn't really give her a very good result. Shang's mother was originally from Changsha, the same city I'm from. Therefore, I felt very close when we met. Shang said,
"You are my sister's student, but also a half-hometown fellow of my family. We don't need to take all the trouble to go out, just stay home and have an everyday family meal."
After the meal, inevitably, Shang and I went to talk about violins. Shang showed me his violin, a pretty good old Italian violin. The reason I say that violin was pretty good, meaning not extremely good, is because it wasn't a violin that should be in the hands of someone at his level. In short, the meeting with Shang, the absolute top in my country up to that time, made me realize very clearly that within violin as a branch of art, regardless of software, way of performing, or hardware, instruments, the violins themselves, China was a great distance behind Western developed countries. I'd rather stop here and omit the details, as it might hurt the feelings of many. Moreover, some information may be considered private or confidential within the industry circle. After saying goodbye to Shang's mother and her son, the great Shang Zhonghua, I walked alone in the street for a long time feeling a total loss and defeat. Just imagine someone finding out that his master is not an invincible man, as he had always believed, and now starts to doubt what he has learned from his master and the value of so many years of effort and hard training. How would you feel? Five, self-renewal from scratch. The harsh reality forced me to realize that if I really wanted to be a violin performing artist and make a living in the West, as the saying goes, when in Rome, do as the Romans. I must adapt myself to the European way of violin playing. Thinking that way, I was glad I wasn't a professor or famous and had no face to lose. As long as I work hard, I can learn and renew, becoming a completely new person. Back to Norway, I completely gave up my peacockry and self-respect as a violinist. I honestly, seriously, and solidly took violin lessons from Professor Ornulf Boy Hansen. As a human, one need to not only be aware of his deficiencies, but also to acknowledge them. It is indeed a painful experience. However, I also came to understand that to realize I'm not a very good violinist, at least not as good as I think, is just like realizing I'm not a very good person, at least not as good as I think I am, and is a life milestone that marks a higher level of maturity and new stage in life. Now that my mind was clear and thinking corrected, everything was on track quickly. After a period of learning and practice, not only my style of violin playing, software, but also my violin itself, hardware, had a fundamental change. I bought an old Italian master's violin for the price of $50,000 in Sweden, which I loved so much that I would die for it. I still remember the last lesson Professor Boy Hansen gave me. He let me listen to the recording of my very first lesson. Hearing that revolutionary, red guard-like energetic harsh flavor, I couldn't help laughing with shame. I must have looked very awkward. It was embarrassing. He then changed to another recording. The cream-flavored sound was very sweet, charming, and elegant. In the end he told me that this was my playing too, that he had recorded in the previous class. I was so surprised I found it hard to believe that with effort one could make such a transformation, beyond recognition. Then, Professor Boy Hansen solemnly announced, basically, you should be able to work for European professional orchestras. Immediately, he invited me to take part in his own chamber orchestra. The very first concert in which I participated was a contemporary Italian work. Unfortunately at the time and until now, I only remember the piece was very difficult, but not anything else, not even one phrase of the melody. Soon after that, I finally got a position with a professional orchestra in Oslo. That meant I had a stable job, or to convert it into a Chinese saying, to hold the iron rice bowl of capitalism. Following, Marianne and I bought a big new condo with a bank loan, and soon after, I bought a used BMW. Like that, Marianne worked for the Oslo University, I worked for the orchestra, our life finally settled down. What is the dream for most Chinese? To fight their way abroad. To live in one's own house, drive one's own car, live together with a Western woman. This should be considered the dream, and my dream had come true. I took some photos of what I owned, house, car, blonde woman, and had them sent to my elder brother Danson back in Hunan, hoping he would show the photos to the whole family, especially to our father. Imagine my father and my family looking at the pictures with wonder and envy. I was immersed in a self-righteous mood, a mood of great satisfaction. My body shape, meanwhile, was unconsciously getting rounder and rounder in that mood, a mood of comfort and contentment. Six, violin sound at the CarlJohans gate. Anyone who has been to Oslo must know the street named CarlJohans gate. Norway is a small country. Oslo is the very small capital of the small country, and at the very center of the small capital, CarlJohans gate is located. It is the most popular and crowded zone in the whole country. It's a narrow walking street leading from the railway station to the Royal Palace, with a total length of, say, about 2 kilometers. By the two sides of the street there are variety shops, cafes. In the evening, people like to gather here for street performers as spectators, or for nothing but hanging out. They walk up and down along the street. When they see something interesting they stop, if not interested they keep going. In the very first days of arriving in Norway, this was a place where I often killed my valuable young time doing nothing. Since I had gotten a job in the orchestra, my life was on track and I had less and less time to waste there. It was a long time since I had passed the CarlJohans gate when one night after rehearsal one of the orchestra members asked me to go through CarlJohans gate with him. That became another turning point in my life. When my orchestra colleague Por and I walked on CarlJohans gate, in the distance I saw a Chinese man with a camera hanging on his chest, standing in the middle of the road. He asked pedestrians passing by whether they would like their pictures taken. That reminded me of when I was at the Shanghai Conservatory of Music and had the same side business of photography service for my fellow students. A sort of sympathy and understanding grew. With a bit of worry, I said to Por,
Nowadays who has no camera? How could he have business?
Wrong. Who every day would carry a camera around? People just take pictures for fun in a good mood. In addition, he is taking black and white. That old thing has become new today. You know, many young people today don't have black and white photos of themselves. I, for instance, have had quite a few taken by him. In fact, some turned out not bad, Por said. Sure enough, there were a few people in a queue waiting for their pictures to be taken. Influenced by the atmosphere, I was about to queue by the end, in part to show a little support to the compatriot, but then I heard the sound of a violin tuning and then violin music. This shocked me because the style of playing that piece of music sounded so familiar, too familiar. I looked toward the direction of the sound and immediately regretted having done so. If I had worn a hat, that hat would have been blown away from my head, not by wind, but by my hair which stood on end. Because the lady who played the violin didn't just have a playing style similar to my former teacher, she even looked exactly the same as her. The reason I put it this way is because even today, I still do not wish to admit this cruel fact. The fact was, the lady playing violin in the street was no one else but my teacher, a professor of the Shanghai Conservatory of Music, our great Shang. Shang avoided showing her face to the audience, totally different from what I used to see on the stage. She occasionally looked up to exchange a look of love with the cameraman. The cameraman, who looked much younger than my teacher, returned her look with encouragement. Then I figured everything out. That was the man with whom my teacher Shang fell in love. It is for this street photographer that Professor Shang had left her second husband, their child, all her students in China, and her honor as a teacher with the title of professor at the Shanghai Conservatory of Music. All to come here and play violin at CarlJohans gate in the cold wind at night. Afraid of being seen by Shang, I quickly hide myself among the crowd. Listening to that familiar sound of her violin, looking at the familiar figure, I was badly hit by an emotional storm. First of all, I felt extremely sorry for a famous violinist, a violin professor, falling to be a street player. Particularly, the professor who was my idol, whom I worshipped, my ideal which I had hoped to reach during my years in China. This was precisely the same person I would feel lucky to meet, honored to shake hands with, proud to be her student, and now, she was actually sort of begging on the street in front of my eyes. No one could say the impact was not colossal. However, this falling to be a street player might, after all, be the general view of ordinary people. Teacher Shang might not at all think the same. Perhaps she was enjoying the flavor of a totally new life, experiencing a new meaning and value of being alive, appreciating human rights and freedom that she couldn't possibly have in her home country. The brain was busy thinking, emotions were also restless, and my heart was touched completely. Imagine, a woman, at her age, close to 50, giving up everything for love. What kind of courage that would take? Could anyone not be moved by that? If that was not reality but in a novel or movie, a pair of lovers, away from home, one taking pictures and the other playing violin to make a happy living together, what a brilliant, touching and romantic story that would be. Unfortunately, in front of my eyes was neither a novel nor a movie, it was simply a plain fact, reality. Especially since I had the distinct impression that it wouldn't be a question of if this romance was a great movement in her lifelong love symphony, but one of how long this great movement could last. Therefore I analyzed my feelings toward the whole thing. I found a quiet part of me being touched by sadness. However, do I really need to be sad? Haven't we heard the saying, I would rather take a short true love and happiness, instead of lifelong together suffering? In fact, again, the way teacher Shang chose to live was her right and freedom. Who am I? Her father? No. I was no more than a student, a former student to be exact. Why should I worry so much about her? I had provided a bridge to get her to Norway. I had already completed my historical mission. Teacher Shang was at least not like many Chinese students, making loud complaints to those who had made huge efforts to bring them abroad, saying things like, "How can you not to take care of me after you got me out of the country? You should be good to me until the end." My thoughts were awakened by a push from my impatient orchestra colleague, Por. He was puzzled and asked me, "Do you know that Asian woman playing the violin?" "Ah," I stammered. To personally know the great Xingzhonghua used to sound like hot air, Chinese people say, blowing a cow's skin, meaning to show off by knowing some great person. But this time, I hesitated to admit and just took a 50 kroner note, stuffed it in Per's hand and said, "Please help me, put it into the violin case." I emphasized put, not throw, it into the violin case. Why so much? Usually a 10 kroner coin is considered more than enough. I didn't let Per finish, pushing his back forward. I walked on, looking back at me, once, twice, with an incredible expression. He gently and carefully put the 50 kroner bill into teacher Shang's violin case. I had no courage to witness my teacher Shang's reaction to the money and rushed home. 7. Self-questioning of my own life. Coming back from CarlJohans gate, I still couldn't get my mind off Shang's playing on the street. I slept not 1 minute the whole night. Shang's brave action of giving up everything for love inspired me greatly, making me rethink the fundamental meaning of life. I seriously questioned myself, do I really feel satisfied with this current lifestyle? Is this truly my goal in life? My mind became clearer after I analyzed my violin life calmly and rationally. It brought me to this kind of conclusion: me, being an individual with strong personality and not sociable by nature, basically am not suited to play in an orchestra in the first place. Besides, I found I never really liked those classical masterworks I played in the orchestra. I felt a distance between me and Western classical music, especially music written for the noble class. On the contrary, I felt much more connected to music with personality and passion, such as ethnic ballads, pop songs, local tunes, country folk music, or even some jazz. In other words, compared with complex symphony, I preferred the simple, passionate, beautiful melodies. In addition, one minor problem with me was that I couldn't really get along well with my orchestra colleagues. Violinists all over the world seem to share this same characteristic: arrogance. For instance, me, as one of the world's violinists, I feel good and very special about myself, not an ordinary feeling good about myself, but feeling extraordinarily good about myself, far superior to anyone and anything. To me, the whole world is made of 4 strings, nothing else. If that was the case, why should I torture myself every day with the same group of people I wasn't good with, to play the same kind of music repeatedly that I wasn't really in love with? Was that really my original intention or dream when learning to play the violin? Is this my purpose in life? We all know life is limited, short. Should I spend my time and life on things I don't like in order to go on living? If so, what's the meaning of being alive? The greatest psychological crisis for a human being is no more than doubting the ideology and meaning of life that one has struggled and fought for, or to deny one's meaning of life. Imagine, my Communist Party member father has to face the fact that the communist ideology as a social theory does not work in reality. All that my father struggled and worked for was meaningless and in vain. What a cruel and broken-hearted picture that would be to my father. Then, I started to recall how I got myself into this violin pirate ship. At the very beginning, I just purely liked the violin sound, the look of the violin and how people played it, for the music too, of course, and a little bit of limelight in front of others, perhaps. Gradually, the violin became a problem standing between my father and I. It became my weapon to fight my father. The purpose was to gain father's recognition. Later, violin turned to be more utilitarian, my means of making a living as well as a way to gain social status. Anyone who wants to be a serious musician needs to have the sense of dedicating all of oneself to classical music. Yet am I really willing to dedicate myself to classical music, to use all my time and life, to go through the numerous great historical violin works? No, 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 I'm a different kind of person. I need to look for the music, or to make music that I really like, that would touch my heart and express my feelings. Hearing that I wanted to quit my orchestra job, a secure income and social status that I worked very hard to get, a dream job that many people would admire, including my teacher Shang, most would think that I must be crazy, out of my mind, but Marianne didn't think that way. She said,
Someone with dreams is far better than someone without dreams. I like you because you are a man of dreams.
"8. Searching for a new way of life. It's a universal and eternal truth that no matter how great one's ideal or how beautiful one's dream, it can't replace everyday rice or bread for Westerners. I, as a person, in the Norwegian society, the equality between men and women is absolute, therefore, I cannot address myself as a man but rather a person, cannot always rely upon the woman with me to feed me, especially when she was wearing two hats, working for the university and continuing her academic papers at the same time. At this time, a man showed up that changed my life's destination. The senior man is called Crow, a violin shop owner in Oslo. When he got to know I could not only play violin, but also make and repair them, he immediately asked me if I would like to have some kind of cooperation with him. We soon became business partners. Later I learned that Crow was at the age of looking for a suitable successor. Based on my past experience with buying and selling Chinese paintings, I knew business would generate economic benefits. Yet I still didn't expect a comfortable life would come so soon after getting myself into the violin business. Not but a few months later I gave up my old BMW, replacing it with a used Mercedes-Benz. However, the economic emancipation did not make me forget that I was a musician, an artist, not just a craftsman or a salesman. I must find my own artistic way of life. For that, first I changed my postgraduate study at the Music Academy from violin performance to violin acoustics. This study consisted of 3 parts: violin acoustics theory, violin playing, and violin making. I began to adjust violin sound and make small repairs for other musicians. Thanks to my violin playing ability, combined with theoretical studies in addition to my intelligence and the ingenuity of my hands, I soon won some fame among local musicians. Unexpectedly, my walking away from classical music did not make my professor Rolf Boy Hansen angry. On the contrary, he encouraged me to do so by saying,
There are various types of music in the world, classical music is just a part of them. To find music that one truly loves, can really expresses one's feelings and have the passion to share with others is everyone's freedom and right. I think this way, and teach this way. That is why I use different methods to teach different students. I do not wish my students to copy me. One Boy Hansen in the world is enough. My task is to find the characteristics of each student and push them towards their own direction. Of course, this doesn't apply to those who are to be professional orchestra players.
Professor Boy Hansen ended up telling me that though he could continue teaching me some violin playing technique and skills, he couldn't help much about the music I might like. So he suggested I go see other professors in other academies in other counties. Following Professor Boy Hansen's advice, I spent several summers at some music academies in other countries, starting first with all the Scandinavian countries, working through to Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, the Soviet Union, Austria, UK, France, Switzerland, south to Italy and Spain, as well as the United States, looking for music that I might like and experts of violin acoustics that I could study with. To my disappointment, almost all teachers and professors in the world were more focused on violin playing basic techniques and skill rather than the music itself. In order to catch original flavor of local or folk music, I decided to find my own way. I tried to get myself into some folk music group. I even spent a few nights with a gypsy band. Through that, I got to know a lot of musicians and music that was new to me. Among the musicians and music, some touched me and moved me very much. Those were perplexing days of my life, until I meet a lady known all over the world. 9. Kyung Hwa Chung, point in a direction for me. The known name is Kyung Hwa Chung, a world-leading violinist. The opportunity to know her came when she gave a recital in Norway. She had a minor problem with her violin. We two Asians in a northern European country soon got along well. Once after rehearsal, we sat together in a restaurant having some very hot Chinese food. When she learned that I was like a little lamb who had lost my way in the violin world, she suggested that it might give me some inspiration listening to the French jazz violinist Stéphane Grappelli. "That's the sound coming from the soul," she said. In addition, she strongly recommended that I go on doing my research of violin acoustics. She also openly told the orchestra that I was a genius when it comes to sound adjustment. That certainly had a great influence on my later career as a violin maker. Stéphane Grappelli's performance opened a window to me, and through the window I found a totally different music world. In pursuit of my violin dream and career, as well as in search of my style of playing and my kind of violin music, I decided to go to Indiana University for further study. The school had accepted me as an MA student before I got out of China. At the same time, my business partner Master Crow set forth his decision of retirement. He made his hope clearly and concretely that I inherit the shop, all tools, materials, instruments, customers of the shop, and work independently. This was truly a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for anyone. But my decision of going to the United States was made. Therefore I showed my appreciation but did not accept the proposal. Of course, nobody in the world would understand my stupid action. Master Crow was so upset that he said, "You want me to go on working until I hit God?" Who could not be hesitant facing such a good man as Master Crow, and all the good things he was offering. But with my undeniable passion and the strong support from Marianne, we became busy preparing to go to the United States. As soon as we received the letter from Indiana University that they would allow me to re-enter the school, we sold all our property, furniture, and car. Marianne resigned from her university job and said goodbye to all her colleagues, friends, and family. Just at the time we had put all of our property into our wallets and were checking the price of one-way tickets to Indianapolis from different travel agencies, I received a letter. A letter from my family. That letter, again, changed my life course. P.S. To avoid misunderstanding, please allow me to explain that many Chinese violinists who went to the West in the 80s were outstanding. Some of them were very successful in the world. But rarely were the successful ones in their Chinese, original package. They were mostly re-educated in Western countries. My former teacher Shang too, after some years of re-study, became a violin professor teaching at a well-known Norwegian music institution until her retirement.